All right, everybody, thanks for coming. This is our follow-up to our Unpacking the Ballot event. We're calling this one Unpacking the Election. I'm Chris Fusco. I'm the executive editor of the Press Democrat. We're going to try to do this in 1 hour tonight. This is another example of a lo-fi event. We are here as if you are in the virtual office with us, just kind of sitting around the water cooler, talking about election results, some of which still aren't in. Joining me on our panel tonight is Jim Sweeney. He runs the editorial page here at the Press Democrat, but is also an astute observer of California and local politics. He'll be talking about statewide props with us and kicking in on some other things. We have multiple Press Democrat reporters here in Emma Murphy, Edward Booth, Jennifer Sawney, and Amy Windsor, and Paulina Pineda. Paulina is our Santa Rosa beat reporter, so she'll dive in there. Amy covers community journalism for us. Jennifer Petaluma, Edward Napa, and Emma Sonoma County. We are also trying to get Richard Hertz from Sonoma State into our event here, but he is having some technical difficulties right now. So we're going to put our discussion of the PD KRCB poll toward the end. We do have Greta Mark here from NorCal Public Media. She's the news director. And also on the line to help field your questions, we've got John Deanna, who's the managing editor of the Press Democrat. He's also running the Give Them the Bird holiday turkey drive. If you have not donated to John's cause, all you need to do is Google Give Him the Bird, and you will see his columns pop up. Okay, so here is how this event is going to work. You all are here. You can put questions into the Q&A as we go through the races. In some cases, our panelists will answer your questions right out of the Q&A. Others, John will flag for me to ask. And yeah, it'll be great to get us started here. Okay. A quick icebreaker question here for Jim. And Edward just published some stories this afternoon. We still have election results coming in, and somebody wrote us asking, is California ever going to deliver a system in which election results will come in more quickly? What do you think?
No, is the short answer, and I can explain why. I mean, California has laws that are designed for maximum participation and for election security. And there are 22 million voters, so that takes time. California allows the counties 30 days to count the vote. That's nothing new, been on the books for years. There's always a close race or two, but if it's some tiny school district in Tulare County, nobody notices. 10 years ago, it was state controller. That one got some attention, but hey, it's been 10 years. Most of us have forgotten. We've got 2 unsettled congressional races in California. The whole country is watching. You know, the Republicans will control the House, but will they have 221 seats or only 219? Explain a little detail without getting too far, into the weeds. After the initial count, there's a canvass. There's an audit, random audit of precincts. They get recounted by hand. They get recounted by machine. Make sure it's accurate. We now all get our ballots in the mail, and almost all of them get returned by mail. Each signature gets checked. Got to make sure they match before the ballot counts. There was a young man here in Sonoma County in 2016, found out his ballot didn't get counted. He said, well, there ought to be a law. And he found a legislator who passed a law, and now counties give you a chance. It's called curing, to come in and fix your ballot if you forgot to sign the envelope, or if they don't think the signature on the envelope matches the signature on your voter registration. These are all the things that lead to it taking a while. And say 22 million voters, 16 million of them casting ballots. going to take a while.
Okay. And we'll get into later with Edward. We've got a couple situations in Napa County where it's coming down to the final 30 votes. So some of the things you cited, Jim, could make a difference in those races. Okay, so just want to as quickly as possible, we had a good discussion about all the propositions statewide. Let's do a quick recap, Jim. It seems like housing-related propositions were not widely received by California voters. And Prop 33, that would have established additional rules on rent control, failed pretty badly. Why do you think that is?
Well, that one's failed pretty badly 3 of the last 4 elections. But what I think is interesting about the ballot measures, if you let me just take a half step back, is I took a look at the electorate. 4 years ago, 17.7 million people voted. This year, 16 million. Much smaller electorate. All right, who was it? Well, Kamala Harris got 2 million fewer votes than Joe Biden. Donald Trump's vote looks almost identical to 4 years ago. So I think Democrats and Democrat-leaning independents stayed home. Ended up with maybe a little bit more conservative electorate. And you think about the pre-election poll and the exit polls and our own survey, what were people worried about? Inflation, the economy. And so I think that's why you ended up seeing not a surprising vote against rent control, because there's a history of that failing here. The one that stuck out for me was Prop 32, was the minimum wage. A California election in November, a large turnout. That's the sort of thing that you'd probably expect to pass. But I think with people concerned about inflation, we had, right, this would have put the minimum wage at $18. Well, for fast food, it's $20. So it probably, most places are already paying that, but a lot of people are unhappy about higher cost of a fast food meal or groceries. And I think that is probably a measure to look at and say, hey, we had a little different electorate this time. We had people who were worried about pocketbook issues in a big way, and they voted a little differently than they might have in another election.
Interesting. So yeah, if you look at, so you're kind of seeing a tie there between 33, which would have given greater flexibility to communities on rent control, pocketbook issues, things like that. It was interesting though that Prop 34, which was tied to Prop 33, passed.
Barely, yeah. And I think that was a really complicated measure that probably people didn't understand, but I think it fit in the theme of the election. I mean, you look at the question, hey, if you're getting your revenue from prescriptions, shouldn't it be spent on healthcare? I mean, I think that question pointed people pretty quickly to yes, and it was still fairly close. And I suspect a lot of the electorate didn't understand the underlying politics, that the apartment association doesn't want another rent control initiative. They were very much targeting one organization, a healthcare organization. And again, getting into the weeds, there are some nonprofits in healthcare that can buy prescription medication at wholesale rates from the federal government, sell it at retail. They make money that way to run their programs. This particular organization uses some of that on housing and ballot initiatives, and this one will end up in court. But I think, again, you kind of saw the pocketbook concern. Hey, if you're taking our money for prescription drugs and you're a healthcare related nonprofit, well, why aren't you spending it there? Same thing with Prop 35. That got into the Medi-Cal sphere. Well, if there's a tax on a health insurance plan, shouldn't that money, I think a lot of that got decided on that level, and just sort of basic fairness in people's minds, and a lot of mistrust of government that probably isn't limited to maybe a more conservative electorate, but was magnified by having perhaps a little more conservative electorate than we're used to in California.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing that. Now, folks, if you want to put questions, there's a Q&A box. If you put your cursor down toward the bottom of Zoom, you can put questions in the Q&A that way. Yeah, Jim, and so, and Prop 35 was really more of a budget flexibility thing, right? I mean, that's what they would have given government the ability to move money around, and now it can't.
Well, government had the ability to move money around. It took it
Right,
away.
right.
And California has a long history of mistrust in government. Prop 5 kind of fits in there. Voters approved a couple of state bond measures, but state bond measures come out of general revenue. They said not so fast on lowering the threshold on local bond measures that trigger property taxes. Now, again, you're kind of looking back at the pocketbook issues. I'm not sure I can afford more. Let's hold back here. That was another measure that might have passed with the electorate 4 years ago, but not necessarily this time around.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that Prop 2, which was 10 billion in borrowing for schools and colleges, and 4, another 10 billion in authorized borrowing for climate change did go. Those did go, but pocketbook and housing issues tended not to go.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of consistent because it's not something people are going to see coming directly from them. And I also think it's important to realize that, okay, you've got different dynamics in your electorate. I don't think we're seeing a full-on realignment here. California voters have traditionally been pretty generous about spending money on public improvements, right? Improving schools, water systems, sea level rise, the climate related stuff. This is still very broadly popular. Even Prop 36, which has been getting a lot of attention, that's the crime measure, has been getting a lot of attention as a, potentially evidence that, somehow there's been a big move to the right. And yeah, more conservative electorate, but here was a measure that divided Democrats. You had opposition from the governor and the legislature, but the Democratic mayors of 3 big cities, San Jose, San Francisco, and San Diego, were all campaigning for it. So we still saw, results that are consistent with California as a blue state, just maybe a little less blue than 4 years ago, 8 years ago. Looking forward, who knows? I think the Democrats should look at this and see some cracks in their foundation that, their voters won't necessarily turn out. Now, the Republicans, I mean, even with his improved showing here, Donald Trump only got 38% of the vote. That's just a slaughter by any other election standard. Steve Garvey did better than Trump, but not much, 40%. So the Republicans have a long ways to go, but I think they can look at this and, see where there are some possibilities. There are some issues where they might be able to regain a footing in California.
Okay. All right. Well, hey, we're going to welcome Rich Hertz here. He's in from Sonoma State University and our survey expert. So, Rich, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, and sorry for my tardiness. I'll give myself an F.
Okay,
I
that's
was
all right.
lean.
Technology is one of those things. Hey, look, they're still counting votes in California. I think we can let you in here a few minutes late. All
Can
right.
I
Well,
jump in real quick on the point that
Sure.
you made? I'm not so sure that I see a shift in kind of on the traditional liberal conservative thing, as much as I think much like the presidential election, this may be a simple, voting no on a lot of stuff that people might have voted yes on. I think it's just the fact that people are worn out financially right now, that so many people are struggling so much and have approved so many things that they're just saying, no, no, no more to this. And I just don't think it's a liberal conservative thing. I think it's more just people just tired out of spending money and just really tapped out. And I think that that also drove a good deal of the vote in the presidential election as well.
Well, it's interesting now. We got our first question comes from Leona, and she's providing an excellent transition from our statewide discussion to our local discussion with Emma and Amy and Edward and others. But Leona's question is one voter concern is two local measures, I and W. And it's just today that we are calling the W race. That was very, very close for the Sonoma County Library referendum. And Measure I was, of course, child welfare. One voter concern is two local measures, I and W, have no sunset clause, which makes one pause even though the measures were popular. So for Emma and Amy, Emma, you covered Measure I extensively. Amy, you covered Measure W. And given Rich's comments about pocketbook issues, what do you think got those two measures over the top? Emma, why don't you go first?
Sure, it's a great question. Measure I, one of the big challenges it faced this election was just competing with the volume of other measures on the ballot, both locally and at the state level. And one of the sort of advantages that I kept hearing from campaign consultants, political analysts throughout the course of the measures campaign was essentially that issues related to children are just a very sympathetic issue for voters. So they just naturally already will have kind of a built-in advantage in that way. And that could have played a key part in what carried that measure through and helped it compete with the other measures on the ballot.
Amy, what do you think about W?
Yeah, really similar to what Emma's talking about. I think with the library, it had almost as much support as it did when it was Measure Y, and did have a sunset clause. I think Measure Y passed with 72%. Measure W, when it didn't have a sunset clause here, passed with 68%. The library, it encompasses and offers so many different services to the entire community. Children, teens, young adults, senior citizens. I think because it offers so much to the community and provides such a, social service, educational service. I think that the loss of, or what could have happened had Measure W not passed, was enough of a incentive to get people to continue to pay that sales tax. Again, unlike it wasn't an additional sales tax, it was a renewal. So I think that helped too.
Well, and it's interesting too, Edward's pointing out in our group here, Napa passed a sales tax. As we saw in the city of Sonoma, it looks like Cloverdale is going to pass a sales tax increase as well. Sebastopol passed a sales tax increase. But for Measure G in Napa, I believe that's a 1% sales tax, right, Edward, with no sunset.
Yeah, correct. And it passed by quite a bit. It's at around 57% approval at the moment. So
which is pretty, I mean, it seems like maybe voters, and this is for anybody in the panel, got the message, hey, well, it's a sales tax. Communities like Napa, Sebastopol, they're going to draw a certain amount of tourists to their downtown. To me, I remember being in Illinois and we would go nuts when sales taxes hit 9%. But it seems like in this part of the world where maybe tourists are footing part of the bill, they're a little more tolerant, or is it just the whole California income thing? I throw that one out there for anybody. Nobody wants to take the bait on that one. Oh, that's right. Amy, Sebastopol's did have well, Sebastopol might not even get to, right, the 10.5, correct?
This is true. So Sebastopol's does have a sunset clause. It's 12 years. And interestingly enough, I got a list today that ranked the approval rates, and Sebastopol's had the highest approval rates of all the, it passed at like almost 73%, and had the highest approval rate of like all the measures and sales taxes in Sonoma County. So people were they really wanted the sales tax. but that would put, if it gets the entire half cent, if the city is allowed to get it, it puts the city sales tax at 10.5%, which is the highest in the county. It actually exceeds the state sales tax cap for Sonoma County, which in order for that to happen, the city will have to go to the California, the CDFTA and go to the Attorney General to get approval for it. So it'll be a process in order for that to happen.
Okay, all right. So Edward, tell us a little bit now about give us the general rundown of where things stand in Napa County as of today, because there are two super tight races.
Yeah, so most of the races are decided, but two measures are still undecided, and this is with, I think it's 99.6% of the votes counted. The registrar estimated that. And both of those measures are Measure B. One of them is a $230 million school bond measure for Napa Valley Unified School District. That's specifically for City of Napa schools because they were successful with a bond measure 2 years ago in American Canyon. The other one is St. Helena. There's a proposal to build a resort at the Charles Krug Winery. And essentially the ballot measure lets the developers get that approved without going through the standard city approval process. And so both of those are the school bond is succeeding by about 30 votes. And the other one, the St. Helena one, is failing by about 30 votes right now. So extremely tight. And they could turn.
So where do you think, I mean, I know you just started doing some reporting today, but I mean, how long do you think this could take for all of this to play out, especially what Jim was talking about earlier in our conversation?
Oh yeah, well, I think supposedly the final results are going to be in by December 5th, maybe on December 5th. So it's kind of coming down to the wire in terms of to call either the races. All the results kind of need to be officially counted and certified. So this is the thing that the registrar is going to send into the state. And yeah, we won't know for either of those races until December 5th, basically.
And then you have to wonder if there'll be litigation or something that creeps out of nowhere to derail them. Anything else out of Napa? I mean, what are your takeaways when you look at Napa County coming out of this election?
So for the city councils, kind of as expected, American Canyon got its new mayor. So Pierre Washington was chosen. David Oro, the other candidate, he conceded, I think, about a week ago. And they got two new council members. St. Helena, they got two new council members as well. Pretty much everywhere else, including the St. Helena mayor, the incumbents won. So Calistoga, two incumbents there. Yountville, two incumbents for council members, and then mayor for Napa, Scott Sedgley, the current mayor, got reelected. Otherwise, a lot of stuff passed, actually. Except the exception is St. Helena, and it's going to be a big deal if the resort measure fails, because their other measure, a real estate transfer tax that was expected to raise around $5 million a year for the city, to help cover this $7 million structural deficit they have, that's failing pretty badly. And there were two measures to enact that, because the city had to become a charter city to legally be able to enact a real estate transfer tax, and both of those are pretty low, 40% approvals. So everything else, though, yeah, Napa sales tax, the countywide transportation measure passed with a pretty good margin above the 2/3 majority needed. yeah. Uh,
But it's interesting that like a real estate like sales taxes are passing, but a real estate transfer tax won't. And it's probably, I wonder if it's got a little bit to do, with the fact that that is a purely residential thing versus everybody contributes to the tax base. Jim, you had one observation on the sales tax passages. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just thought it was worth taking note that almost all of the taxes on the ballot are crafted to pass by a simple majority. They're general taxes with the revenue to be spent at the discretion of the taxing authority. Special taxes like Measure I used to require a 2/3 vote, still do if it's placed by the city council, the board of supervisors, the library commission. That was 2/3. But this was an initiative. It went on with signatures, and the state Supreme Court ruled just a few years ago that the voters can place a tax on the ballot by initiative and pass by a simple majority. It would have failed. I mean, 60+%. It was a very solid majority for Measure I, but before the rules were rewritten, that would have failed. So I think the new rules make a difference for that one, and the simple majority, I think, probably helped the others.
Okay, question from the audience. Is there anything that triggers, is there an automatic recount trigger in California if something is, no?
No. And it's very costly. Anybody asking for the recount has to pay for it themselves.
Okay, okay, interesting. All right, let's pivot over to Santa Rosa and Paulina. Paulina, give us the rundown. There were some business and hotel tax measures on the ballot. How did those fare in Santa Rosa?
Yeah, they passed with about 65 and 67% of the vote. They only needed a simple majority. The business tax, I think, which had drawn a lot of interest and some scrutiny from the business community early on, would revamp the tax, which is about 30 years old. It would institute new minimum tiers and then raise the cap that larger businesses like department stores, grocery stores, auto dealerships, some of our healthcare providers are charged from $3,000 to $10,000 annually, and that'll increase a certain percent with inflation. Measure E, that was Measure E. Measure FF, the hotel tax, that would raise the city's lodging tax or transient occupancy tax 2 percentage points from 9 to 11%. Both would generate about $4.2 million annually. At a time that the city is looking to plug some holes in its operating budget. It's a very small percent of the overall structural deficit that the city is projecting over the next couple of years. And it would go to the general fund to pay for, sort of daily operations, roads, public safety, parks, things like that. But definitely, I think, a needed boost, even though it's a small amount sort of in the long
Yeah, and
term.
if memory serves me right, initially the business tax proposal was much greater, right? And there
Yeah.
was a lot of squealing about that.
Yeah, originally, the original proposal would have eliminated the tax. So for larger businesses, some of them were estimating that their tax would jump from 3,000 now to 100,000 or more, which I think was initially really hard for some businesses to swallow and try to figure out how to incorporate that into their budgets at a time when they're also seeing increased costs. But it would have been like $12 million annually for the city, which obviously is a bigger boost than what they're seeing now. But I think, the city said that what they said it is probably what it would have been if they would have adjusted for inflation over the last 30 years. And they felt that was sort of a compromise both for businesses, but also, for the city, who is still getting a little bit of money.
Okay, and voters clearly got behind that.
Yeah, I think
it-
kind of going back to the sales tax, the campaign behind the measure sort of pitched it as, everybody will pay into city services, visitors, businesses, and it wasn't a sales tax on residents. And so I think, it was much lower turnout in the citywide tax measures compared to sort of countywide and other city races. So I think it was at the very end of the ballot, so probably also helped that maybe not everybody got to the end of the ballot to vote on it, but they passed with more than they needed. So
Interesting. Okay. And in your council races, I mean, you really only had one super hot one. And that super hot one didn't even really come down to the wire, did it?
yeah, that was in the city's District 5 race in the central part of the city between Caroline Benuelos and Jeremy Newton. I think, pretty early on, Caroline jumped to an early lead, and she really stretched that with every ballot dump that we got since election day. I think, last time I checked, it was about 60-40, and it hadn't really changed much since like last Tuesday or Friday. I think, we didn't call it immediately. There were still a lot of votes out there to count. But Jeremy conceded last week. I think he felt that he really couldn't make up the difference in the last, couple of batches that we would see. He had hoped that, some of the money spent on door knocking and mailers in the last week or two of the election would kind of give him that boost to overcome the difference. But he felt that there weren't enough votes out there to do so.
Yeah, I mean, you get kind of two similar minded candidates, right? And I wonder if the difference in this one kind of came down to party organization, right? Because Ben Willis had Democratic Party backing.
Yeah, she had the party backing and the backing of all of the Democratic party affiliates, and the Young Dems and some of the SSU Democratic groups. They really, I think, were pivotal in her campaign to helping her do door knocking. They walked the district 3 times by the end of the campaign. She's also, well known in the community. She's been around 30 years, has lived in the district 10 years. And I think both through her connection with the Democratic Party, but also her work in the community, had built some really good relationships. Which she really, I think, kind of pointed to that and to her team's work as sort of giving her the win.
And then in District 3, you have the incumbent one pretty easily. I guess when you look at the council going forward, how do you see Ben Willis's win kind of playing a role on the council and sort of policy in Santa Rosa going forward?
It'll be a fairly young and inexperienced council. Benuelos is replacing Chris Rogers, who has served on the council since 2016. He won his race for state assembly. Nobody on the council has more than 2 terms. They'll be electing a new mayor in December, and I think that's a little bit of a toss-up. I think there's a lot of people potentially interested in becoming mayor, and there's not really someone who has emerged as having a clear 4 votes. They're facing a big budget deficit, and in January we'll be voting on some budget cuts and additional cuts come May time during the budget year. So I think sort of that lack of I think the inexperience and having someone like Chris Rogers, who really kind of helped them coalesce around issues. Not having someone like that, I mean, on the council will it might be hard for them to, come together on some of those type of budget cuts or bigger decisions that they'll be making. Housing, is surely to be a big issue in the coming year. We're hearing that, the city's seeing less projects coming in. They're probably going to be voting on, maybe by the end of next year or the year after, on a very large housing project out in the fire zone, which is, I think, always a concern for some of the residents there. So yeah, I think it'll be a bit of a transition to see who sort of emerges as some of the new leaders on that council.
Okay. Pretty interesting. Well, we're going to pivot south into Petaluma with Jennifer, where there was no shortage of council madness. Jennifer, how's it shaking out now? I think we were just finally calling some races recently, right?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Jennifer Sani. I cover Petaluma, and so two out of the three district of the council races have been called. So we have Frank Quint will be in District 4, and Brian Barnacle will be in District 6. And Brian Barnacle he's pro overlay, which has been a huge topic, the overlay downtown historic district. And Frank Quint, last I heard, he hadn't stated his position on whether or not he supported the overlay. But the last race that we're still waiting on, which has a difference of 270 votes, is District 5, which is technically in downtown. Part of it's in downtown, but extends south. And we have Alex DeCarly in the lead by 270 votes to Blake Hooper, Planning Commissioner Blake Hooper. So that we're still waiting to see how that's going to turn out with that regard.
And then with the overlay, I mean, just a quick little summary here. That's a downtown development, basically creating 3 zones where some existing rules now could be changed to allow for taller buildings. Obviously, the Charlie Palmer Hotel project is the catalyst for this, but how that plays out could be a little bit. I think we called it in the paper, the battle for the soul of Petaluma's future. How do you see it shaking out? Barnacle's win, obviously, he would be a pro overlay vote. Is it still up in the air, kind of based on that last seat?
Yeah, so it's very much a discussion or a fight for Petaluma's soul and its heart. But I think just based on the current council, they've just based on the discussions, they've sounded more open to the overlay. But I mean, ultimately we'll find out in January after they do hold the final vote. But thus far, I think if DeCarly did win the race for District 5, I'm presuming he and Karen Now would likely vote against the overlay, with the rest of the council, Janice Cater Thompson, Brian Barnacle, Mayor Kevin McDonnell, and John Shribs more likely voting for it. And so I think, it might move forward, but I think things have kind of shaken up there. They're parsing out. It was originally 3 zones, and it's still technically 3 zones, but one of those zones has been divided even more. And there's information that's recently come out that, there initially many thought that the overlay was a result, came out from staff because there is a belief that they couldn't do spot zoning. Now staff has said, oh no, we can do spot zoning. So I think it's still it's still going through the public process of being worked out, fleshed out. So we'll see how different it is when they do the vote on the final EIR in January.
Okay. Let's shift to Petaluma City Schools. Tell us about how the bond questions played out, and that'll be a segue into Amy to talk about the other Sonoma County districts.
Yeah, so Petaluma had 3 bond measures or 3 measures on the ballot for schools. One was for the Waugh School District, a small two school district. They sought a parcel tax, an $89 parcel tax. It required a 2/3 vote, and thus far it's at about 62% passage. So I don't think it's not gonna pass. But the other 2 is for Petaluma City Schools district, and they put in, there's 2 bonds, one for the elementary side and one for the joint Union High School district, which serves the high school and junior high, but technically they all work together, and both have passed thus far. They just needed a 55% majority, and so the Petaluma City Schools bonds would increase property taxes by $30 for each per $100,000 of assessed value. So they think it will bring about $159 million for the schools to help with the facilities, with removing asbestos, and but it won't go towards teacher salaries.
Okay, all right. Well, that's a good segue over to Amy. How did school ballot measures do throughout And we know we're still waiting on the big one in Napa, but how about in the rest of Sonoma, Amy?
So yeah, like Jim had said earlier, this evening, California voters and Sonoma County voters like to support their students and their children, and that was the case throughout most of Sonoma County, except in Windsor, with the Windsor Unified School District. They sought, I think, the largest school bond in the county, which was $122.5 million. And that does not look like it is going to pass. It is split pretty even, 49.91% to 50.09%. It does need a 55%, 59% to pass. There's like a 24 vote difference. Anyway, that does not look like it's going to pass. There's 81% of the potential ballots have been counted. But again, it'll need to make up quite a bit of ground. Elsewhere throughout the county, school districts will be getting some bond money thanks to voters. Cotati Rohnert Park School District will be getting $91.5 million. And again, this is over like 30 years. Piner Olivet didn't look like it was going to pass at the beginning with early returns, but as more and more ballots have been counted, it's eked by with a 56%. So that looks like that's going to pass. That's a $29.5 million bond. Roseland has passed. That's a $12 million bond. Sebastopol Union School District, that's a $24 million bond. Bellevue Union School District, that's a $38.5 million bond. Healdsburg Unified is a $49.5 million. And then Wright School District in Santa Rosa, that's another story, kind of like Piner Olivet, where it didn't look like it was passing with early returns, but as more and more ballots have been counted, that's just started to eke by with a 57.5% voter approval rate. Again, I guess that could still go either way. There are 72.5% of the ballots have been counted, so I guess if there are still more ballots out there, and it could dip potentially. So again, I would say Wright School District and Piner Olivet are still too
Close to call.
we'd want to wait to call those, but I'm sure both of those school districts are just biting their nails, waiting till the end of next week. So that's where school bonds are here in Sonoma County. So lots of new buildings and HVAC systems coming in the next couple of years throughout Sonoma County schools.
I want to shift gears quickly to a couple of the more interesting local races, and then we're going to get into our poll to conclude. Healdsburg was a really interesting election because, again, if memory serves me right, you had the growth management ordinance question, which failed miserably. But then you had all of the people who supported it and put it on the ballot got reelected. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Measure O was a change to the city's growth management ordinance. It would have exempted multifamily housing units from this GMO in 3 specific corridors in the city. There was an organized opposition, which wasn't so much against housing. It wasn't like a NIMBY organization or opposition. It was more so an opposition against the council that put it on. And there were 3 incumbents running for re-election this year. This opposition, they didn't really trust the council. They didn't trust why they put it on. They thought that there was going to be a bunch of changes made, and they were just like, no, we don't want this. Interestingly enough, all the incumbents got reelected. So looking at these, election night, we saw these results coming in, and we're like, what's going on here? As I've talked to a couple of local Healdsburg residents, and they're like, we don't like change. We like things the way they are. So it's interesting to hear from local residents about what they think about their election results as well. And also as a community newspaper reporter. So
yeah, it's interesting. You can't help but think there's a few parallels there between what's going on with Petaluma and the overlay and expansion of downtown the battle for the soul of the town. The same thing in Healdsburg. Well, it's been this way the whole time. We don't want, in these very small corridors, a very limited amount of multifamily housing that could potentially be more affordable.
Well, and there's going to be change coming. I mean, the SMART train is coming up to Healdsburg. It's something is going to happen. Growth is going to happen there at some point. And it's just a matter of what they want that to look like. So, and the Measure O was an attempt at that, I think.
Okay. All right. So super fast. We had the Windsor trash measure, and voters clearly trashed the trash measure, right? They voted in favor of competitive bidding for their future garbage contracts. Probably not a surprise at all that happened.
No, that was put in by voters in the first place, and voters said, let's keep it.
Let's keep it. And what happened to the roundabout question in
So
Cotati?
yeah, you're talking about Cotati roundabout in 2012. Voters said we don't want roundabouts. We don't want them. And then a group this year, it was a citizens initiative. They gathered enough signatures to say we want them again. And voters approved that. So roundabouts can be built in Cotati again. So that doesn't mean that there are any like slated. You're not going to see a Cotati or a roundabout like January 1st, but they can be planned for Cotati again.
All right. Let's pivot from all of our local races to sort of a discussion of our Press Democrat NorCal public media poll. With Emma's been covering it on our end. Greta, you've been covering it for NorCal, and Rich, you kind of came up with the idea for this. So I want you to kind of describe what your thinking was, and kind of in talking to NorCal and the PD about it.
Well, it just seemed like a good thing to do, and it was kind of a late blooming project, so we had to do something fairly simple and straightforward. So decided not to try to do a scientific sampling because it would have taken a lot longer, and there was a lot more to doing that. So we just decided to go and see what readers of the Press Democrat and listeners to KRCB FM thought. And it turns out that even though it was unscientific, we got a tremendously bigger sample than I expected. In my pollster's prayers, I was hoping for at least 500, and would have been really happy with 1,000. And we got nearly 3,000 responses, 2,915 completed interviews. We also had another 600 and something partial interviews, which we probably could have taken some of those as well. They may not have answered every question, but when we had such a mass, there was really no need to pick through those. But even though the sample really just largely reflects the demographics of both the Press Democrat and KRCB listeners, for instance, almost 60% of our sample was over 60 years of age. And you might say, oh my God, how can they be anywhere near accurate? Well, it turns out that they're very representative of who actually voted. And for all the chasing of younger voters and worrying about this group and that group, at least here in this county, older voters still rule. And the poll results turned out to be quite accurate in terms of the election results. I scratched a few notes here. In the PD poll, we had the presidential race at 77-19 for Harris there, and that actually bumped up a lot in the 2 days after the election there. I think a lot of people were frustrated and took the poll, but the actual results so far in the county are 72 to 25, and so really a pretty good representation, and an even closer representation on the Measure on Measure J here in Sonoma County, where we had it at 13% in favor, 83% against, and 4 undecided, and it turned out 15 to 85. It so just kind of looks like the undecided is just sort of split there. But so even though you sometimes don't pull a scientific sample and you look at the demographics and say, oh wow, this doesn't really look like Sonoma County, turns out that it looked a lot like the electorate there. And people, often, I don't know how many dozens of pages of comments we got, but there were a pile. I didn't add them up, but people had a lot to say. And, I've lived here almost my entire adult life. And this place it's kind of a pollster's dream because people are so active and engaged in this county, much more so. There have been a number of elections where we've either been in the top turnout bracket or the top turnout county here, and people care. And so it's really a pleasure to poll here or there. And I think that, the fact that so many people responded was an encouraging sign that people do want to be heard and stuff.
So Greta and Emma, you have read a lot of the crosstabs, a lot of the comments. Greta, what jumped out at you in sort of doing some reporting on this survey?
Well, I mean, for us personally, I mean, in radio news, it's kind of a one-way street. We're broadcasting, and we don't have any idea about who's listening, what they want to hear. So for me, it was just getting that feedback, all those comments, to really to hear from folks and hear what they think. And so for me, it was a lot of valuable information. And also, as I've said to you guys before, that about 600 people provided their email and said that they would be willing to be contacted by a KRCB or a Press Democrat reporter. And for me, that is invaluable because it's so hard for us to be out there and getting to be able to have that conversation, that relationship. So for me, that was the most important. And it was just, just to hear what everybody had to say about Measure J. It was really, really fascinating.
What was the most fascinating part of the Measure J response?
Emma, what do you think? We've talked a lot about this in our two ways over the last week and a half.
Yeah, we have. On Measure J, I'd say the thing that really stuck out was just the answers really sent home just how much people care about the local agriculture industry here and the access to local ag products. So, the sort of protectiveness that people felt about their local farmers having access to local farmers market. There was a real concern that the measure was going to negatively impact local farmers, was going to impact the cost of food locally grown. And so that's what was reflected in the votes that we saw. People were valued that pretty highly.
Okay. As far as like the reactions, and Rich referenced the numbers, how we're pretty close to what we saw in the election results, but when you started to look into why the Trump voter voted for Trump versus why the Harris voter voted for Harris, some interesting takeaways there. And Emma, I think maybe you could start the summary of those.
Sure. Yeah. I'd say that on the presidential results, the things that really stood out was the breakdown, Chris, as you were just referencing, between the Trump voters and Harris voters. And we saw among the top issues, there was just real division. So for Trump supporters, immigration and inflation were the top issues that they named in the survey. And then for Harris supporters, we saw democracy and abortion rights and women's health care as the top issues that they named there. And then some other interesting points from those presidential questions we saw was that there was real sort of mix of perspectives on how satisfied voters were with the choice of the candidates. So I think we had 29% of survey participants said they were somewhat satisfied with the choice of candidates. 24% said they were very satisfied, and 22% said they were very dissatisfied. And then asked if the other candidate played a role in the decision about who to vote for. 37% said their vote was mainly cast as a vote for their preferred candidate. 26% said it was a vote against the other major candidate, and 35% said it was some of each.
Wow. Yeah. So kind of a split across the spectrum. Greta, did you ended up it's interesting because while we know this Sonoma County and California in general overwhelmingly voted for Harris, did you notice anything in just sort of reading the comments of Trump voters, and were there any takeaways or revelations there for you?
Um, uh, again, let me ask Emma. Let's ask Emma the same question.
Putting them on the spot.
Happy to. So the aside from the issues that we saw pop up, the sort of common thread throughout was just a general anxiety over the outcome of the election, and that was going both ways. So it was we had Trump voters expressing fear over what was going to happen depending on the results of the election, and then Harris voters as well. There was just a lot of gloom and doom, kind of, fear that the country was really going to, or is going to fall apart, that it was really heading in the wrong direction, and that there's just a lot of high stakes, essentially, is just throughout we saw in a lot of the comments.
Okay. It was also interesting, Emma, your third story in the poll series, kind of talking about how people viewed their communities, and it was just interesting to see how the Rohnert Park downtown proposal seems to get a lot of people excited. And Greta, you're right there in Rohnert Park. Are
That's
you
right.
excited?
I was really surprised. People are loving the direction of Rohnert Park, and specifically about, I mean, Emma, there were some comments. People were some people were apprehensive. Is this going to go the right way, that property? But tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, no, there was some apprehension, of course, but it was just interesting seeing the comments. So many of them were kind of celebratory and in talking about the downtown, just excitement about having more of a downtown feel, more of a center, and what it could mean for just the growth of the area. But the flip side of that was, people were in the comments as well saying they were worried about the impact to roads, the infrastructure, the traffic. Some folks were excited about the downtown so long as the plans were really thoughtfully laid out. They didn't want another, strip mall type feel. They wanted something more kind of unifying and different.
Organic.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are button up on an hour. We're going to close with Rich here. So Rich, tell us what you thought here now that, obviously the election results are in and we've got a pretty sound picture nationally of kind of the margin of victory. How do you think the national polls did leading up to election day? How's the pollster looking post election?
Well, we as an industry have taken a pretty good and deserved beating the last couple of elections there. It's called non-response bias, the technical term, when supporters of one candidate are just less likely to take polls than supporters of another candidate. And there was still evidence of that in this election here. But what I think was different was that pollsters generally were ready for it and weighted their data appropriately. Maybe the biggest tell, and I was really kind of in my own mind saying, boy, I wonder if they're going too far, but they were absolutely not. And what I'm referring to is the New York Times, who basically in their statistical weighting of the data that try to reflect what they thought the electorate was going to be, nearly doubled the number of high school only education people who took the poll, figuring that there were still a lot of shy Trump supporters out there who weren't necessarily going to respond. And so they basically just really bumped up that group that he runs so well in. And polls were really largely very accurate. The polls, were basically saying this is a race that could go either way in the popular vote. And of course, the Electoral College is an entirely different story. But it was a very close vote. And I think you can fool pollsters once, you can do it a second time. It's pretty rare that it would happen 3 times in a row because, we're going to try to adjust as best we can. Part of the problem with polling these days is just the very low response rate. When I stopped doing phone polling 22 years ago because of the low response rate, in the prior years, doing a lot of press Democrat polls, we would get somewhere between 35 and 40% of the people that we tried to reach who actually took the poll, which was, a decent number. The Times, which runs an excellent poll and has the resources to just keep calling people back and calling people back again, they were averaging between 1% and 4% of the people that they tried to reach who actually took the poll. And you would naturally be suspicious of that, saying, boy, well, how can a group with so many refusals, be representative? But I think that their statistical weighting wound up being very accurate. And, we just try to do the best we can. But when so few people choose to respond, which is really ironic given how connected our society is these days, polling is more of a challenge, and that we just are constantly looking for creative and new ways to reach people. And the Times is one of the few people that still does the phone poll. I don't know how much longer they're going to do that, but we just have to get people to, where they are, and it's a continuing challenge.
All right, right. Well, this has been a challenging election to cover, as this past hour represents. I think we still missed a few races as we've discussed it, but my thanks to all of you for joining us. Thank you all participants. You'll be getting an email from us with a follow-up. It'll have a Press Democrat special subscription offer in there in the event you are not a subscriber. But yeah, appreciate everybody coming out. It's been a really interesting election, and still some results coming in that you can look at on both the NorCal public media site and the Press Democratic site to get those results. So appreciate everybody joining us, and have a good evening, and we'll do it again soon. Thanks.
Thank you. Learned a lot.
Likewise.